My child, what I am about to tell you is not a story you will simply listen to. It is a story you will feel, because somewhere inside it, you already know a version of yourself. Sit with that thought for a moment. Somewhere out there, someone is walking toward you right now, without even knowing your name, carrying a question that only you can answer. Nothing about this moment is ordinary. And by the time this journey ends, you will understand exactly why. Imagine, for a second, that you have spent years believing you were simply too much. Too quiet in some rooms. Too intense in others. Too guarded when people got close, too transparent when you finally let them in. You built a life around small, careful movements, the kind of life that looks fine from the outside but feels like holding your breath from the inside. You told yourself that maybe love, real love, the kind that doesn't flinch, simply wasn't built for people like you. And then, one ordinary afternoon, someone walked into your life who was never supposed to matter this much. Maybe it happened in a coffee shop where the barista called out the wrong name and you both laughed at the mix-up. Maybe it happened in a hallway, a parking lot, a stalled elevator, one of those forgettable places where nothing important is supposed to happen. But something did happen. A conversation stretched longer than either of you intended. A silence between sentences felt comfortable instead of awkward. You noticed the way they listened, not waiting for their turn to speak, but actually hearing you. You didn't call it anything yet. You were careful not to. But some part of you, the part that had learned to protect itself, quietly loosened its grip. The days that followed felt strange in a way you couldn't quite name. You found yourself replaying small moments from the conversation, the exact words they used, the way they tilted their head when you said something unexpected. You told yourself it meant nothing. People are curious about new faces all the time. It doesn't have to mean anything more than that. But somewhere underneath the practical, reasonable version of yourself, a quieter voice was already asking a different question. What if this time is different? Weeks passed. Then months. And in that time, this person did something almost no one had done before. They paid attention. Not to the version of you that you presented to the world, the polished, agreeable, easy-to-love version. They paid attention to the parts you tried to keep hidden. The way your voice changed when a certain topic came up. The way you deflected with humor when something touched a nerve. The way you sometimes went quiet mid-sentence, as if catching yourself before revealing too much. They never pushed. They never demanded answers. They simply noticed, and they stayed. There is a particular kind of relief that comes from being noticed without being interrogated. You didn't have to explain yourself in that first season of knowing them. You didn't have to perform steadiness you didn't feel. You could simply exist in their presence, imperfect and unexplained, and nothing seemed to be at risk. For someone who had spent years bracing for the moment attention turned into demand, this was new. This was, in its own quiet way, the beginning of something you didn't yet have language for. But that was only the beginning. Because one evening, almost by accident, they discovered something about you. Something you had never said out loud to anyone, something buried so deep that even you had started to doubt whether it was real. It wasn't a scandal. It wasn't a betrayal. It was smaller than that, and somehow larger too. It was a piece of your history, a quiet wound from years ago, one that had shaped the way you loved, the way you left, the way you flinched at kindness because kindness had once been used to hurt you. You hadn't meant for them to find out. It slipped out in an unguarded sentence, a photograph you forgot to hide, a name mentioned in passing that made your whole body go still. And in that instant, you braced yourself. You braced yourself for the look you had seen before, the one that said this is too much, the one that meant the slow retreat was about to begin. But that look never came. Instead, something in their expression softened, and then sharpened with a kind of quiet determination you hadn't expected. They didn't ask you to explain yourself. They didn't demand the whole story right then and there. They simply reached for your hand and said the kind of sentence that changes the shape of a person's future: "I'm not going anywhere. But I think I finally understand you." You didn't sleep much that night. Not out of fear, but out of something closer to disbelief. You kept turning the sentence over in your mind, checking it for hidden conditions, for the fine print people usually attach to promises like that. You found none. It was simply what they meant, plainly and without performance. And that, more than anything else, unsettled you in the gentlest possible way. What happened next changed everything. Because understanding, real understanding, doesn't stay quiet. It moves. It acts. Over the following weeks, you noticed small shifts, the kind only someone who truly sees you would think to make. They stopped asking certain questions that used to make your chest tighten. They started leaving space instead of filling every silence. They learned the difference between your tired quiet and your hurting quiet, and somehow, impossibly, they never confused the two. They began doing small things you never asked for, and never mentioned doing them, as if the kindness itself was the point, not the credit for it. They remembered which anniversaries were hard for you, not the happy kind, the quiet, complicated kind, and made sure you were never alone on those days without ever naming why. They learned your specific silences the way other people learn a language, patiently, imperfectly, but with real devotion to getting it right. You began to feel something you hadn't allowed yourself to feel in years: safety. Not the temporary safety of a good mood or a good day, but the deeper kind, the kind that lives underneath everything else. The kind that doesn't disappear when the weather changes. And yet, a new question began to form, one that would follow you for the rest of this journey. If they knew the truth now, the real truth, the one you had spent your whole life protecting, would they still choose you when the initial rush of tenderness faded? Would this understanding survive the ordinary days, the difficult ones, the ones with no grand gestures at all? Because understanding someone in a single revealing moment is one thing. Choosing them, again and again, long after the surprise has worn off, is something else entirely. You began testing this, though you would never have admitted it at the time. Small withdrawals, disguised as busyness. Short answers, disguised as tiredness. You were, in your own quiet way, checking whether their patience had a limit, whether their understanding would survive contact with an ordinary, unremarkable Tuesday. Every time, they simply stayed present, undramatic, unbothered, as if your testing wasn't even registering as a test at all. It was simply met with the same steady kindness as everything else. Few people could have imagined what came next. One night, months after that quiet confession, you found yourself doing something you had never done before. You told them everything. Not the edited version, not the version designed to be palatable, but the whole truth, the parts that made you wince to say out loud. You told them about the years you spent convincing yourself you were unlovable in the specific, complicated way that you were. You told them about the nights you rehearsed goodbyes before anyone had even said hello, just so you would never be caught off guard by loss again. You told them about the person from your past who had taught you, without meaning to, that vulnerability was a door left open for someone to walk through and never close behind them. You told them about the year you stopped answering calls from people who loved you, simply because you no longer trusted your own ability to tell the difference between safety and its convincing imitation. You waited for the shift in their eyes that never came. Instead, they told you something that rearranged the way you understood your own story. They told you that they had noticed something the very first day you met, something they had felt but hadn't yet understood. A familiarity that made no logical sense. A pull that felt less like attraction and more like recognition, as if some part of them had been waiting for some part of you long before either of you knew each other's names. At first, you dismissed it as the kind of thing people say in the early, golden days of love, before reality settles in. But then they told you something else, something that made the air in the room feel different. They told you they remembered you. Not from this life exactly, but from a feeling, a sense of unfinished familiarity that had followed them through other relationships that never quite fit, other rooms that never quite felt like home. They didn't claim to understand it fully. They weren't asking you to believe in anything you didn't already believe. But they said it anyway, quietly, honestly, because it was true for them. And strangely, impossibly, it matched something you had felt too. A recognition you had never spoken aloud because it sounded too foolish, too much like the kind of thing people only say in stories. The truth was far more surprising than either of you expected. Because what they had discovered about you wasn't only your old wound. It was also the reason that wound had shaped you the way it did. The reason you learned to read a room before entering it. The reason you noticed small shifts in tone that other people missed entirely. The reason you had spent years becoming someone who paid such close attention to the people you loved, because you had once loved someone who never paid attention to you. Your pain, it turned out, had built the very qualities that made you the kind of person someone could finally, fully love. There is a strange kind of grief that comes with this realization, the grief of understanding that your suffering was not meaningless, that it built something useful inside you, even as you wish it had never been necessary. You sat with that grief for a while, turning it over slowly, and for the first time it didn't feel like a weight. It felt like something closer to peace. This is the part of the story where many people expect a downfall. A misunderstanding. A sudden distance. A tragic turn designed to manufacture tears. But that is not what this story is about. Life does not always demand tragedy to be meaningful. Sometimes the most powerful twist is simply this: two people choosing to stay, clearly, honestly, and on purpose, even after all the truths have been spoken. In the weeks that followed, you noticed something shifting inside yourself. The old fear, the one that whispered you would eventually be too much or not enough, began to quiet down, not because it disappeared entirely, old fears rarely do, but because it no longer had the final word. Every time it rose up, this person's steady presence answered it before you had to. You started sleeping better. You started speaking more freely, no longer measuring every sentence for the reaction it might provoke. You began to notice the small architecture of a life built on trust, shared plans made without hesitation, difficult conversations that ended in closeness rather than distance, the quiet comfort of being known and staying anyway. There were still difficult days. That much never fully changed. Some mornings the old fear returned uninvited, sitting quietly in the corner of the room like an old visitor who refused to leave for good. But you noticed something new in those moments, too. You no longer had to face the fear alone. You could name it out loud, without shame, and watch it lose some of its power simply by being spoken. If you are watching this and recognizing pieces of your own story in it, take a breath here. Ask yourself honestly, is there someone in your life who has seen the parts of you that you tried to hide, and chosen to stay regardless? Or is there a part of you still waiting for permission to be fully known? You don't have to answer out loud. Just notice the answer as it rises. Because this story is not only about them discovering something about you. It is about what happens after the discovery. It is about the specific, quiet courage required to remain soft after being hurt, to remain open after being disappointed, to let someone in after years of building careful walls. But the story was not finished revealing itself. Because a second discovery was waiting, one neither of you saw coming. It surfaced almost by accident, the way important things often do, tucked inside an ordinary conversation about an unrelated subject entirely. You were talking about an old dream you once had, one you had abandoned years earlier without much explanation even to yourself. And as you described it, something shifted in their expression, the particular stillness of someone recognizing more than they expected to. It turned out that this dream you had quietly buried was something they had once wondered about too, in a different form, years before you had ever met. Not identical, but close enough that the coincidence felt less like coincidence and more like evidence of something neither of you had language for. Two separate lives, shaped by separate griefs, somehow curving slowly toward the same unfinished longing. Neither of you tried too hard to explain it. Some things resist tidy explanation, and forcing one onto them only diminishes what they actually are. Instead, you simply sat with the strangeness of it, letting it settle instead of demanding it make sense. This discovery changed something quieter but no less important than the first. It gave you both permission to imagine a future you had each abandoned separately, now made possible by staying, together, in the present. You began speaking about that old dream differently, not as something lost, but as something merely delayed, waiting for the right conditions to return. If this story has stirred something in you, a memory, a hope, a quiet ache for the kind of understanding you've been waiting for, take a moment and share it. Write down the feeling this brought up, even if it's just for yourself. Some truths only become real once we admit we recognize them. And this is where the final piece of the story reveals itself. One evening, nearly a year after that first conversation in the coffee shop or the hallway or the parking lot, wherever your particular beginning happened to take place, they sat you down and told you the rest of what they had discovered. Not just about your past. About your future. They told you that somewhere along the way, without meaning to, they had stopped imagining a life without you in it. Not in the dramatic, sweeping way people describe in movies, but in the small, undeniable way that becomes clear only in ordinary moments, reaching for your hand out of habit, saving the last piece of something because they knew you'd want it, waking up and immediately wanting to tell you about a dream before it faded. They told you that understanding your pain hadn't scared them away. It had shown them exactly why staying mattered. Because love, real love, isn't the reward for being easy. It's the choice to remain present for someone's complicated truth, and to love them more deeply because of it, not despite it. They told you something else, too, something you hadn't expected to hear that evening. They told you they had spent the past several weeks quietly planning something, not out of obligation, but out of certainty. They wanted a life with you that didn't require either of you to hide, a life built openly on everything you had both revealed to each other, the wounds and the dreams alike. In that quiet room, with nothing dramatic happening around you, no music swelling, no grand gesture waiting in the wings, you finally understood something that took you far too long to learn: you were never too much. You were simply waiting for someone patient enough to stay long enough to see all of you. This is the moment where every thread of the story comes together. The discovery was never really about a secret or a wound or a hidden history. It was about proving, slowly and honestly, that being fully known does not have to end in abandonment. Sometimes it ends in the opposite. Sometimes it ends in someone choosing you more firmly because they finally understand why you are the way you are. In the months that followed, the two of you began building something neither of you had dared imagine in your separate, guarded years before this. Not a perfect life, no life like that exists, but an honest one. A life where difficult conversations were no longer something to fear, because you had already survived the hardest one together. A life where old wounds were acknowledged without being allowed to run the show, where new dreams were nurtured without either of you needing to abandon them out of fear this time. You found yourself, on ordinary evenings, simply grateful. Not for some dramatic rescue, but for the quiet, daily choice this person kept making, to stay, to understand, to grow alongside you instead of demanding you arrive already finished. And if you have ever wondered whether someone could love you fully, wound and all, let this be the reminder you needed today: the right person does not run from your history. They walk toward it, gently, and help you carry it, until one day it stops feeling like a burden and starts feeling like the very thing that brought you both together. Wherever you are right now, whatever chapter of your story you're standing in, know this: your past does not disqualify you from being deeply loved. It is often the very reason someone will recognize you when they finally arrive. Before we close this chapter tonight, ask yourself one more question, quietly, honestly. If someone discovered everything about your past today, every wound, every fear, every carefully hidden piece, would you trust that the right kind of love could survive it? You don't need to answer aloud. Simply let the question sit with you tonight, and notice what your own heart already believes. If this story gave you even a moment of hope tonight, stay a little longer. Subscribe, and let this be the beginning of a journey we continue together, one story, one truth, one quiet revelation at a time. Because somewhere out there, your own chapter is still being written, and it is far from over. Your like helps this story reach someone who needs to hear it tonight. Your comment lets me know I'm not just telling stories into the void, I'm telling them to you. So like, comment, and subscribe, because this journey is better with you here.